My name is Clementine, and I was born with cerebral palsy. I was raised by my Grandpa Ty and Grandma Martha. They are the only family I've ever known. They were kind and loving and taught me so many things with so much patience. They both died about a week apart, shortly after my 18th birthday. First, it was Grandpa Ty, and then Grandma Martha, even though she was several years younger and appeared to be in perfect health. It was almost as if she decided it was time to go, and so she did. I was surprised to learn that they were sitting on a tiny fortune which they left to me. It wasn't enough to live extravagantly, but enough that I wouldn't have to worry about anything, at least financially, for the rest of my life. Grandma and Grandpa were buried in the Lockhart family cemetery behind the house, where Grandma had once grown her prized Baccarat roses. I had never seen a rose there, but it was always full of the most beautiful wildflowers. I would often sit near their marble headstones in the late afternoon to read a book or just listen to the wind blow. One such afternoon, I dozed off to sleep, and when I awoke, it was nearly pitch dark, except for the soft glow of the moon shining down on the headstones. I sat up a little disoriented. The night was silent except for the gentle rustling of the trees. As I regained my senses, I realized the glow was not from the moon at all. It was a solid column of light coming from above. I was terrified as the ground within the circle of light began to tremble. A dark shape rose from the ground and up through the light. Dirt cascaded to the ground as the shape rose at least 100 feet in the air. Then, in a flash of darkness, it was over. It was like when the power goes out unexpectedly. I sat frozen still in the murky blackness. It was so dark that I became afraid that I was floating alone in some endless, shapeless void. I searched the darkness for a star, a bit of the moon, something I could orient myself to, but there was nothing. Then dark gray clouds moved above to reveal a full moon, and I was relieved that I was still on solid ground. I looked again at the graves. A single black baccarat rose curled over the top of Grandma's headstone. Had it been growing there all this time and I just hadn't noticed? That was the first thing I ever witnessed that there seemed to be no obvious rational explanation for. Over the next year, I consumed every book about UFOs, aliens, and extraterrestrial life that the library had to offer. I'm pretty sure the librarians had a special name for me, like the Cuckoo Lady or something, because I would see them whisper to one another and laugh anytime I came in. Sometimes they would read the titles of the books aloud with great amusement as they checked me out. I didn't mind. Once I exhausted the library's resources, I turned to the local bookstore. That's where I met Nicholas, a young man about my age who looked at me like no one had ever looked at me before. It was like he was the first person who ever really saw me, the real me. He too had cerebral palsy and an even bigger obsession with the subject of aliens, so we became fast friends. Quickly, friendship turned to something more, and I decided to do something spontaneous. I asked Nicholas to move in with me at the farmhouse. Soon he had introduced me to a few online UFO groups, and it really opened up my world. Finally, I had found my people. Things were great for a while. Then Nicholas got really involved with a UFO group that seemed a little too intense for my taste. He would spend hours at the computer doing research for the group. He'd meet up with them for coffee or something and be gone for days, then return with no explanation, and wonder why I was asking him so many questions. This started happening more and more. Nicholas had devoted his life to the group. When we did spend time together, he seemed uncomfortable. I was an outsider now because I wasn't interested in the amazing things he said the group was going to do. Of course, he would never elaborate on what those things actually were. Late one night, after not hearing from him for a week, Nicholas called me crying, barely able to speak. He said something amazing had happened to him that he just couldn't explain. He was healed of his cerebral palsy. For some reason, a wave of jealousy and something like resentment washed over me when he said that. Nicholas asked if he could come over immediately, and I agreed. When he arrived, I felt a little uneasy around him for the first time ever. Not only was he walking without his arm braces, but he was strong. He picked me up and whirled me around in his arms. He sat me down when he saw the fear in my eyes. "I know this doesn't make any sense," he said, "and I can't tell you much, but I wish you'd finally trust me and come meet Cal." I was apprehensive, but how could I refuse? I had to make some sense of this. I had heard so much about Cal, the leader of the group, that I was nervous to finally meet him. He was a tall, lean man with sharp, cold features, but he was so warm and welcoming and told me how much he too had heard about me. I had been skeptical for so long, but Cal's stories hooked me in immediately. He said that, like the rest of us, he had been drawn to aliens and UFOs at an early age and had practically wasted his early 20s trying to sneak into Area 51. He never got closer than 100 yards from any official building before being chased away, but one night a large white van exited the perimeter fence and drove in his direction. He knew he was well hidden, so he did not move. From that spot, he witnessed a government man bury 3 living people, seemingly at their will, in almond-shaped metal containers the length of a coffin in the ground just outside the fence. The G-Man then placed a tape player on the ground about 10 yards from the burial site, and soon it filled the silent canyon with the haunting sounds of a pod of whales. Cal had gazed up at the sky and noticed that the moon was dark. When he looked back for the G-Man, he had disappeared. Then about a half an hour later, an inexplicable column of light shone down on the burial site, and 3 dark shapes rose from the ground and up through the column about 100 feet, disappeared for a few minutes, then returned to the ground. The light then vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, and the G-Man returned to unearth the vessels. In the last vessel, a young woman emerged. The woman and the G-Man stared silently at each other for some time, and then they embraced, and he heard the woman say, "Nelson, my love, I'm healed." Cal returned to the site every night for nearly a month, but not until the next moon phase would the strange ritual occur again. The same van exited the fence, but a different G-Man emerged and buried 3 different bodies, and this time they seemed to be lifeless or at least heavily sedated. Cal watched for more than an hour, but the column of light never came. He imagined if the people underground were still alive, they wouldn't be for much longer. Soon the anxiety became too much, and he decided he had to act. As he reached the burial site, he was relieved to find that the shovel used to dig the hole had been left behind, and he used it to dig up the first vessel. Once unearthed, he clawed at the smooth sides frantically. There was nothing to grip, no handle, but he finally got it open. Inside lay a young boy. His eyes were closed, but he was alive, breathing shallowly. His legs and arms were twisted gruesomely, but it was apparent they had grown that way, perhaps due to some sort of birth defect. The boy's eyes snapped open abruptly and he gasped for air. Cal said he jumped back startled, and before he could even think what to do next, he was chased away from the area by 4 men in yellow hazmat suits. Undeterred, he returned to the site each month, and each time someone was there to perform the same ritual. Sometimes the light would come, and sometimes it wouldn't. He made notes of the minor differences between each ritual until he knew the parts that seemed to work most certainly. He said he never saw the boy with the twisted body again, and had always wondered what had become of him. After attending a few meetings, I had ingratiated myself to Cal enough that I was invited to the cornfield for the monthly sowing, as they called it. These occurred at different phases of the lunar cycle, and 3 people were selected by Cal to participate. The 3 selected were already getting comfortable in their vessels when Nicholas and I arrived at the actual event. Nicholas stood beside me as Cal visited with the people in each of the vessels. The first was a petite woman named Jenny, whom I had met briefly at one of the meetings. She had lost both of her legs in a car accident years ago. The second was a man in the late stages of Parkinson's, whose body shook so violently it had to be exhausting. The third was a young woman who was born blind and completely mute. After each of the selected reaffirmed their desire to continue with the process, the vessels were closed, then lowered into the pre-dug holes. Once the holes were filled back in with dirt, Cal explained that humans could survive underground for a little over 5 hours. The selected, however, would be dug up immediately after an hour had passed, whether there was an encounter or not. The eerie moaning of a whale pod blasted from the little boombox Cal held on his shoulder as we waited quietly about 100 yards away, among the stalks of corn, not necessarily hiding, but not making our presence obvious either. A half hour passed, and I could sense the uneasiness in the group. Suddenly it all seemed rather silly, and I felt a tiny bit ashamed of myself, always so eager to believe. Nicholas whispered to me. Cal told me that I was underground for 55 minutes before the mothership arrived. I don't remember the waiting at all. Inside the vessel, I felt perfect peace. Suddenly, Cal cut the music, and a bright column of light shone down on the disturbed ground where the vessels lay buried underneath. A deep, growling mechanical sound filled the valley, and the ground rumbled terribly as 3 shadows ascended up the column of light. After what only seemed like a few minutes, the shadows returned through the column. Then the light switched off like a street lamp. The mechanical sound rose till it was almost deafening, then just as quickly faded to complete silence. Nobody spoke or moved for several minutes, then Cal instructed the diggers to uncover the vessels. Nicholas wrapped his arms around me, and I realized I had been shaking the entire time. "Isn't it wonderful?" he asked. I could only shake my head in agreement as I stared on anxiously as each vessel was unearthed. Cal opened the top of each vessel one by one, and when I saw no immediate movement, I started to panic. The female amputee roused first. I gasped when she stood up on 2 sturdy bare legs. The blind, mute woman crawled out of her pod next. She was crying uncontrollably, reaching with her arms and calling out for Cal in a thick-tongued kind of slurring way. I felt pity for her. She hadn't been healed, I supposed, but then I realized, before tonight, she had not been able to make any sound at all, not even a grunt. Cal called for her by name. "Astrid, come to me and tell me what you see." Astrid snapped her head in Cal's direction. She was matching a voice to a face for the first time in her life. She walked to Cal and caressed his face. "There's so much beauty," she cried, and then she collapsed into his arms. We all walked over to the last vessel. I felt panic again. The man with Parkinson's was lying in his open vessel, completely motionless. Nicholas rushed to his side and placed his hand on his chest. "I can't feel a heartbeat. Does anyone know CPR?" he yelled. Suddenly, the man's hand shot up from his side and grabbed Nicholas by the wrist. "Shh, just let me lie here for a moment," he said solemnly. "I've never felt such peace before." Some members of the group cheered, and others, like myself, simply bawled our eyes out. I had many questions for Cal, and he seemed genuinely happy to answer them as he walked with me through the rows of corn. "Why must the vessels be buried underground?" I blurted out. Cal smiled like a patient teacher, then he somberly explained, "Once the ritual is in process, you mustn't interrupt it. Not with body movement or the distressing sound of a human voice. If the vessels were above ground, someone would break out or yell or rock the vessel. We've seen it before, and the mothership doesn't come. It's a wasted opportunity and unfair to the individuals who can control their fear. We were all afraid when it was our time. It's only natural. Think of it as a rite of passage, to be buried and then rise anew from out of the earth. It can be a traumatic experience, but I promise you, there's absolutely nothing to be afraid of, and if you'll remember that, it can be a wonderful experience too." As everyone began to leave, Cal welcomed us all to the next meeting where he would select the next candidates for the sowing. Nicholas drove us home, and we just held each other's hand in silence the entire ride. There were no words to describe the feeling. There was a sort of communion between Nicholas and I in that moment that I suspected I would never share with anyone else again. At the next meeting, I was selected by Cal, along with 2 other new prospects, to participate in the next sowing. It would be a full moon phase commonly known as the corn moon or harvest moon. A handful of the group called it the singing moon, as some Native American cultures had, and I liked that name best. It was lyrical, magical. Everyone was excited for me. Even the original members of the group who kept to themselves hugged me and said how happy they were for me. Then Jenny, the girl with the new legs, approached me and stared deep into my eyes as tears filled her own. Then she kissed me on the cheek and walked away without a word. Cal played guitar and we sang at his feet all night long. I felt seen and loved, and my heart was full. There was nothing left to do now but hurry up and wait for the next moon phase. The selected had been asked to arrive early. Cal picked me up on the day of the event, and we arrived just as the holes were being dug. I watched as the 3 empty vessels were laid in front of the holes. The excitement was excruciating. Soon, the other selected arrived as well. One was a young woman with severe schizophrenia who repeated ad nauseum how she was sole surviving heiress of well-known Hollywood dynasty. The other was a man whose lower body had been crushed in a horrific warehouse accident. Each of us was fitted with some sort of remote monitoring armband, so our vital signs could be observed from the surface in case anything should go wrong. We were also given a watch with a glowing face to track the time, and a dictaphone with a recorded message from Cal that he said we should play if we started to panic. The rest of the group began to arrive, and Nicholas came over to speak to me. He didn't say much. He took my arm braces and promised me I wouldn't need them anymore as tears streamed down his face. Cal announced that it was time to begin the ritual, and that now was our last chance to back out if we didn't trust the process. No one changed their mind. We reaffirmed our commitment and were helped into our vessels. Cal motioned for the pods to be closed, and in a moment of panic I searched for Nicholas's familiar face. The closing pod door obscured my view, but I saw him across the way, in the cornfield. He and Jenny were hugging tightly and both were crying. Then he kissed her forehead like you only would with someone you loved deeply. The vessel snapped shut jarringly, and the thought fleeted as I was lowered softly into the ground. I was startled by the tinny metallic explosions as the dirt was shoveled on top of me. Then the sound grew thicker until it stopped completely. I looked at my watch. 10 minutes had passed. Then I heard Cal's slightly muffled voice as he spoke to the group. I was surprised by how well I could understand what he was saying from 6 feet underground. I stared at my watch. 20 minutes. 30 minutes passed, and then I realized I had to relax and let go. I must have gotten so relaxed that I dozed off for a bit. I came to, coughing. The air in the vessel had gotten thicker and quite warm, making it very uncomfortable to breathe. I told myself not to panic, but then I heard the schizophrenic woman buried next to me scream. I looked at my watch. 5 hours had passed. Oh my God, what's happening? I thought, panicking. Were they having trouble digging us out? No, that can't be it. They've had 4 hours. I watched them dig 3 holes in solid ground in less than an hour. I heard Cal's voice directly above me as he called for Nicholas to come to him. I yelled, "Cal! Nicholas! Help!" Then coughed several times. The air I was breathing would be poisonous now. As loud and forcefully as I could, I screamed out, "Help me! Someone please help me!" But there was no response. My breathing had become painfully ragged. I couldn't understand why no one above seemed to be panicking or doing anything at all. I heard the woman next to me scream again, but now she was hysterical. She pleaded to be rescued from the demons buried inside with her. The paralyzed man made no sound at all that I heard. Perhaps he was already deceased. I knew I needed to slow my breathing, but I was gasping for air like a fish out of water. I heard Cal's voice again, directly above my head and quite consoling. "My dear Nicholas," he began, "I know well the guilt you are feeling, but remember, you did this for your sweet Jenny. You can finally start to really live your lives together. And your idea to identify prospects with money and no family was brilliant. These three were loaded." My head and heart began pounding in sync. "It can't end like this. It's not my time to go. It just isn't fair," I pleaded to no one. My mind reeled and I started to hyperventilate. Then I remembered the dictaphone. I don't know why I thought it would be of any comfort except that maybe it would provide some answers. I pressed play and Cal's voice crackled through the tiny speaker. A voice that was once warm and knowing to my ears now sounded smug.
"Relax, dear traveler, and fear not. Providence awaits. You've no doubt heard me tell the story of the boy with the twisted body who was not healed. What I didn't tell you is that, later, I came to understand that that boy was not meant to be healed. He was intended to be a sacrifice. A sacrifice I caused to be delayed due to my ignorance. What we now know is that with every new moon, the mothership heals 3. But come the harvest moon, she requires 3 fresh bodies for herself. You were not merely chosen for this honor, but predestined. And you must think of it as an honor. There was no malice in this determination. It was only a matter of timing. Like the song says, there's a time to plant, a time to reap, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to laugh, and a time to weep. It's your time to weep now, and we too will weep for you. We pray you pass quickly and painlessly before the mothership arrives. Don't fight it, sweet soul. You mustn't dare cling to consciousness, for the horrors that await your earthly body next are inconceivable. It's time to let go now and shuffle off this mortal coil. Release your energy and essence back to the earth, so she may cradle your soul as you return to the source. Take comfort in knowing that your life force will usher in a new humanity, one that is perfect. This is not an end, but a wondrous new beginning. With your sacrifice comes the next evolution of humankind. So won't you sing with me, one last time?
I stopped the tape. I couldn't stand to listen anymore. They're basically waiting up there for me to die. How kind, I thought to myself. I tore the monitor off my arm and threw it toward my feet. I was so angry. I had only wanted, just once, to run barefoot through the wildflowers back at the old house. Now I would give anything to see it one last time. I had been used, betrayed, and swindled, but I had also been so naive. I heard voices above begin to murmur, then the muffled thumping sound of a dozen feet walking across the dirt I was buried under. That was followed by the abrupt sound of car doors slamming and the rumble of engines starting then slowly fading as they drove away. I felt myself slipping out of consciousness. The moans of whales began to echo hauntingly above. The ground began to shake and rumble violently, and I lost all sensation in my body. I still had my thoughts, though, and at least a few moments to reflect on my life or even to dread what would happen next. But instead, there was only jealousy and envy. My last moments were hijacked by the pettiest of human emotions. And that would have been the worst part. But then I recalled a terrible dream I had several times after my grandparents died. In the dream, I had just died as well. And as I passed through the dark void of some endless space, getting closer and closer to a burning white light in the distance, I heard Grandpa plead from somewhere far off, "Stay away from the light, dear." Then I heard Grandma, terribly distressed, "Go back if you can, sweet daughter. There's only hell. There's only hell."
There's only hell.